So I researched the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This act was enacted around the time of the Civil Rights Movement. It was in 1954 that the segregation of black and white students in the school system was declared unconstitutional. With the Civil Rights Movement in full swing, the idea of equal rights for all was popularly supported by the general public. So now at the forefront of many political agendas was the issue of education. So in 1975, President Gerald Ford in Congress signed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, EHA. EHA was created in order to ensure that children with disabilities had access to an education as well as due process of law. It was in 1990 that EHA was amended and the name was changed to what is known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act today. So, by law, states have to educate all students with disabilities, and the goal of IDEA is to provide some financial support to do so, but state and local districts have to abide by the 6 main principles that are set out in the IDEA. So the first is that every child is entitled to FAPE. FAPE is an acronym for Free and Appropriate Public Education. Free meaning that all eligible students with disabilities will be educated at the public's expense. Therefore, the child's family isn't made to pay extra for the education of their child with a disability, even though it may be really expensive. But the parents don't ever have to pay for that. Inappropriate means that the student with a disability isn't entitled to an education that fits them. So it's tailored to meet their needs, and this is done through services such as an IEP, which I'll talk about later. And the public in education is just pretty self-explanatory. Public refers to the public school system, and education is education. So the second principle that schools and agencies have to abide by is that when a professional at either a school or an agency believes that a child may have a disability that is hindering the child's learning or behavior, that student is then entitled to an evaluation in all areas related to the suspected disability. So then the third principle piggybacks kind of off the second principle. So if it is then after the evaluation, if it's suspected that child does have a disability, there's the creation of an individual education plan, an IEP. So the purpose of an IEP is to lay out a series of specific actions and steps through which all of those who are involved, so that includes the school system, the parent, and the child, the basic people. So it's so that all of them can help reach the child's goals. So I'm gonna just kind of go through a couple of the steps that you have to go through to get an IEP through IDEA. So the first step is that the child be identified as possibly needing special education. This is done through a number of ways, such as Child Find, which requires each state to identify, locate, and evaluate all children with disabilities. And then it can also be done through a referral from a school professional or just a request from the parent to someone at the school. The second step is that the child be evaluated. By law, this initial evaluation must be what is known as full and individual. This means that the focus should be only on that child. The next step would be that a group of professionals look at the evaluation and then determine whether or not a child is considered a child with disabilities by the guidelines set forth in the IDEA. Some of the disabilities that are included under IDEA include autism, deafness, blindness, speech impairment, emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, or developmental delay. And then So once it's determined whether or not the child has a disability, the parents and the school system sit down to determine the specifics of the child's IEP. So then the fourth principle that has to be abided by is that the education and services be provided in the least restrictive environment possible. And though it's not always possible, it would be an ideal that the child with disabilities be placed into the classroom with what's known as like the general population students. And that's just like to provide kind of diversity, I think. I read a lot about like parents that are of like the children with disabilities. It provides like a normalcy for them, and then for those who don't have disabilities, it provides them a way to see other people that may be different from them, and like kind of sets forth like earlier in life, like that not everyone's the same, and like everyone has like struggles, and so it just provides diversity as well. So the fifth and sixth principle go kind of hand in hand with that. The input of the child as well as the parent have to be taken into account when doing the IEP and the evaluation. So then that kind of jumps into the next principle. If the parent feels that an IEP is not appropriate for the child, or on the flip side, that if a parent feels that their child is not getting the needed services, they have that right to challenge the school or agency's treatment of their child through IDEA's due process. So in 2004, amendments were made to this act, were made to this act, IDEA, and as a result of these amendments, all special education teachers have to be certified specifically in special education. This is so the child is able to have the best education possible, and sometimes when a teacher is not specifically trained with those needs, it can make it very difficult to know how to best teach the child. Also, the IEPs have to contain annual goals that are measurable, along with a description of how the child's progress towards meeting those goals will be measured and reported. Another is that a new provision releases schools from the current requirement to show severe discrepancy between achievement and intellectual disability to determine if a child has a specific learning disability. So what I understood that to mean was that they no longer have to, if they're doing well, but it seems that they may have something going on, they don't have to use just that to determine whether or not the child has a specific like learning disability. So many of these changes bring IDEA in alignment with the No Child Left Behind Act, just where the child with disability they're held accountable as well. So the standardized testings, like they still do those, and maybe tweaked a little bit, and they're still able to use their IEPs, from what I understood, but they're still held accountable in the school system because of No Child Left Behind. So because of the quickly growing population of children with disabilities federally, special education spending has increased at a much faster rate than general education spending. State and local districts, though, haven't been able to really keep up with the always increasing special education expenses, because it's just so much, and it's happened in such a short time that it's really hard for them to keep up. So IDEA is considered underfunded, but not described as an unfunded mandate. This being because every state can determine whether or not they want to participate. And as of right now, there aren't any states that have opted out, but some could decide to forego these funds in order to avoid complying with IDEA's due process requirements. So when the act was first created, it was believed that the cost of educating those with disabilities would be twice as much than other children. So Congress, when taking this into account, like creating the act, took this number into account when setting the maximum federal contribution, and they set that at 40% of state average per pupil expense. But as of right now, it pays less than 19%. So it's skewed. I don't know. The rise in special education spending is less, not because of this rise in special education spending is less because of a disproportionate increase in the cost of services, and has more to do with the expansion of what is considered to be disabled than when the act was first created. So I would say that people who would support this policy are the child's family, disability activists, and as well as schools. The child's benefiting from it. They are getting the education. The child's family, I think, benefits from it because if they don't believe that their child is getting like the correct education, because of the due process, like they're able to like put their voice out there and say like, I don't agree with this. So, and I think schools also benefit from having like diversity. But on that same token, I believe that though many schools support the act itself, the financial part of it is something that seems to be very problematic for the school districts. And it's because of the underfunding of IDEA that it makes it really hard for schools to provide well-trained teachers, as well as provide all the necessary tools and aids that special education requires. I know my mom works with special education in middle school, and I have visited, and there are about 4, 5 aides, not including the special education teacher, and there's probably 15, 16 kids, and some of them they are on the autistic scale, or there are some who their mobility is limited, and it's just there's such a large diversity of what is considered disabling, and you have to figure out what each specific student needs, because the one who maybe has a feeding tube needs something else that the one who is autistic, they're just two different things. So also I found that the in 2004 the Senate passed it with with the amendments, and it was an 87%, or it was 97.8% of the votes were yay, whereas, and so 48% of those votes were Republicans, and 43 were Democratic, and the remaining 8% was just other. So then when it went on to to the House, it was a little bit more definitely split. 58% of that was yay, so it was the majority, but then there was a remaining 41% that was nay. And what I see is that 80% of Republicans of the Republican Party were a part of the yay votes, where 89% of the nay votes were Democratic. And I'm not entirely sure why that is, because you would think that with liberals being so open for new ideas and things, that they would be okay with this, but it was more the conservatives who voted yay in the House. So that is what I have found on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.